I think the most likely scenario by far where the Russians use nuclear weapons is where they're losing. And in 2022, when the Ukrainians were doing very well and the Russians were surrendering territory in Ukraine, I think that was a very dangerous time. Because if the Russians were to lose in Ukraine, I believe they would use nuclear weapons.
And let me just add, at this point, we talked about this in the interview that we did 2.5 years ago, and I'm going to link it somewhere up here, but continue.
Okay,
Yeah.
But that was the scenario to worry about, because the Russians view what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. Many people in the West refuse to accept the argument that the Russians view this as an existential threat or NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. But you want to understand, the Russians think it's an existential threat, and it's what they think that matters. So they think it's an existential threat. If they're losing in Ukraine, that's when we really have to be worried about nuclear use and the possibility of escalation up the nuclear ladder. But that's not happening. Russia's going to win the war. Okay. And in fact, I don't think Trump or Harris will be the principal driving force behind ending this war. It will be events on the battlefield.
Oh, can you quickly, just a quick question in between. What does it mean when you say Russia's going to win the war? What's that going to look like?
They're going to end up conquering a large slice of territory in eastern Ukraine.
And is Ukraine just going to, what's it called, capitulate? Like, are they just going to wave the white flag and say, we're done now?
Yeah, I think that that's going to happen at some point in a not too distant future. To put it in slightly different terms, so I'm perfectly clear, I think the fighting or the shooting is going to stop. Okay. But what's going to happen, in my opinion, is you're going to get a frozen conflict. This is a very important point to understand. I do not think you're going to get a negotiated settlement. You're not going to get a peace agreement. Right? Because the Ukrainians in the West will never accept Russian annexation of territory inside of eastern Ukraine, and they will continue to flirt with the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And that means you can't work out a deal. Remember the conditions that Putin has stipulated for getting a peace agreement. Right? We're not going to accept those conditions. You're not going to get a peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. And you want to understand, once that frozen conflict sets in, the West, mainly the United States, but the West, and this will include the Germans, and Ukraine will go to great lengths to undermine Russia's position in Ukraine and to undermine Russia itself. The Russians, for their part, are going to go to great lengths to cause trouble in Europe for as far as the eye can see, and the Russians are going to go to great lengths to poison transatlantic relations. So you're going to have this nasty competition between Russia on one side, Ukraine and the West on the other side.